The crystal wine glass shattered against the imported Italian marble, sending fragments across the Persian rug like scattered diamonds. But this wasn't just another wealthy family argument in a Beverly Hills mansion. This was the moment when $50 million, a dying war hero, and a secret that had been buried for 30 years exploded into a courtroom battle that would expose the darkest corners of American family greed. 3 people entered that room that stormy October night. Only one of them knew the truth about who really deserved to inherit everything. By morning, police had arrested the wrong person, the media had destroyed an innocent woman's reputation, and somewhere in a hospital bed, an 80-year-old veteran was fighting for his life while his family fought over money that didn't even belong to them. The woman they called a gold digger was actually trying to save her husband's life. The son who seemed so concerned about his father's welfare was secretly planning to put him in a nursing home. And the young caregiver everyone dismissed as just another minimum wage employee. She was about to reveal a DNA test that would change everything anyone thought they knew about this family. Before we understand how this inheritance war began, let me tell you about Robert Mitchell, a man whose entire life was built on a foundation of honor, sacrifice, and the kind of old-fashioned values that seem to have disappeared from modern America. Robert wasn't born into wealth. He grew up during the Great Depression in a small farming town in Oklahoma, where his father lost everything when the banks failed in 1932. At 17, Robert lied about his age and enlisted in the Marines, spending 3 brutal years fighting in the Pacific Theater during World War II. When he came home, he used the GI Bill to study engineering, met a beautiful schoolteacher named Dorothy, and together they built Mitchell Construction from nothing more than a second-hand pickup truck and an unshakable work ethic. For 30 years, Robert poured concrete, built shopping centers, and slowly accumulated the kind of wealth that only comes from decades of 16-hour days and never taking a vacation. By 1985, Mitchell Construction was worth $23 million. Robert and Dorothy lived modestly, drove sensible cars, and saved every penny they could because they'd lived through poverty and never wanted to experience it again. They had one son, James, who grew up expecting that someday all of his father's hard work would become his inheritance. Dorothy died of breast cancer in 1998, and for 5 years Robert lived alone in their modest ranch house, slowly retreating from the world as grief consumed him. His son James lived in New York, building his own career as an investment banker, visiting maybe twice a year and calling once a month. Robert was fading away until the day he hired Patricia Barnes as his housekeeper. Patricia was 38 years old, recently divorced, working 3 jobs to support her teenage daughter Sarah. She wasn't looking for romance when she took the job cleaning Robert's house twice a week. She was just trying to pay rent and keep her daughter in college. But Patricia saw something in Robert that everyone else had missed. Underneath his grief and loneliness was still the same man who had charged up beaches in the Pacific, who had built an empire with his bare hands, who deserved to spend his final years with dignity and companionship. Their friendship developed slowly over months of shared conversations, home-cooked meals, and long evenings watching classic movies. When Robert asked Patricia to marry him in 2003, she said yes because she genuinely loved him, not because she wanted his money. They signed a prenuptial agreement that gave Patricia nothing beyond a small monthly allowance and the right to live in their home for 1 year after Robert's death. Everyone who knew them understood that Patricia had married Robert for love, not money. For 20 years, Patricia devoted herself completely to Robert's care and happiness. When he was diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease in 2018, Patricia researched every treatment, consulted with specialists across the country, and structured their entire lives around keeping Robert's mind sharp and his spirits high for as long as possible. She hired Sarah Williams, a certified nursing assistant and single mother of 2 young children, to help with Robert's daily care. Sarah worked for minimum wage plus overtime, treating Robert with the same respect and affection she showed her own grandfather. Robert's condition progressed slowly but inevitably. By 2023, he needed assistance with basic daily activities, though he still recognized Patricia and Sarah, still enjoyed watching baseball games, and still had enough mental clarity to understand that his family loved him. Patricia had spent nearly $200,000 of Robert's savings on experimental treatments, private medical care, and home modifications to make his life as comfortable as possible. The money was worth it to her because every day Robert smiled or laughed or remembered something from their past together was a victory against the disease that was stealing him from her piece by piece. James Mitchell had been watching his inheritance disappear for years. Every visit home revealed more changes, more equipment, more expenses related to his father's care. James calculated that at the current rate of spending, there might not be anything left to inherit by the time Robert died. As his father's mental capacity declined, James began to believe that Patricia was manipulating a confused old man, spending money that should rightfully belong to the Mitchell family legacy. James convinced himself that his concern was really about protecting his father from financial abuse, though deep down he knew that his primary motivation was preserving his expected inheritance. In September 2023, James hired a private investigator to examine his father's finances and look for evidence that Patricia was stealing money. The investigation revealed that Patricia had indeed moved large sums from Robert's accounts but not into her own name. The money had been transferred to medical research foundations, experimental treatment centers, and long-term care facilities. Patricia wasn't stealing from Robert. She was spending his money exactly as he had instructed her to do, trying to buy him more time with treatments that weren't covered by insurance. The confrontation that destroyed this family happened on October 14, 2023, during what was supposed to be a peaceful family dinner. James had flown in from New York specifically to confront Patricia about the missing money, bringing with him bank statements, receipts, and a folder full of accusations. Sarah Williams was working late that evening because the October storm had made driving dangerous, and she didn't want to leave Robert alone while Patricia prepared dinner. The conversation started calmly enough, with James asking reasonable questions about medical expenses and care costs. But as the evening progressed, James's questions became accusations, his tone became hostile, and his language became increasingly cruel. He called Patricia a con artist who had seduced a vulnerable old man. He threatened to have her arrested for elder abuse. He demanded that she sign over power of attorney and move out of the house immediately. Patricia tried to remain calm, showing James the medical records, the doctor's recommendations, and Robert's own written instructions about his care. But James wasn't interested in explanations. He wanted Patricia gone, and he wanted his father's remaining money protected from what he saw as ongoing theft. The moment that changed everything happened when James grabbed his father's arm and announced that he was taking Robert to live in a memory care facility in New York, where he could receive proper professional supervision. Robert, who had been quietly listening to the argument, suddenly became agitated and confused, pulling away from his son and reaching for Patricia. James's response was to grip his father's arm more tightly, telling him that Patricia had been lying to him, that she didn't really care about him, that she was just waiting for him to die so she could steal everything he had worked for. That's when Sarah Williams made the decision that would define the rest of her life. Sarah stepped between James and Robert, gently removing James's hand from his father's arm and positioning herself as a human shield protecting the elderly man from his own son. Sarah told James that he was scaring his father, that Robert's agitation could trigger a medical emergency, and that he needed to step back and lower his voice immediately. James's reaction was explosive and completely out of proportion to the situation. He accused Sarah of being part of Patricia's conspiracy, called her an unqualified caregiver who was only after money, and demanded that she leave the house immediately, or he would have her arrested for trespassing. What happened next lasted less than 30 seconds, but would be replayed in courtrooms, news broadcasts, and family conversations for months to come. Patricia had been filling wine glasses in the kitchen when she heard James shouting at Sarah. She rushed into the dining room carrying a crystal goblet filled with expensive burgundy, arriving just as James was attempting to physically push Sarah away from his father. Patricia shouted for James to stop, raising the wine glass in a gesture that was meant to get his attention, not to threaten anyone. But James interpreted Patricia's movement as an attack, lunging toward her just as she stepped backward in surprise. The collision sent the wine glass flying from Patricia's hand, shattering against the marble fireplace and sending glass fragments across the room. One large shard struck Sarah's forearm, opening a deep gash that immediately began bleeding heavily. The sight of blood transformed an argument into what appeared to be a violent assault, and James immediately called 911 to report that Patricia had attacked Sarah with a wine glass. When police arrived at the Mitchell house 23 minutes later, they found a scene that seemed to support James's version of events. Sarah was in the kitchen with a towel wrapped around her bleeding arm. Patricia was attempting to clean wine and glass from the dining room floor, and Robert was sitting in his chair looking confused and frightened by the chaos around him. James calmly explained to the officers that his stepmother had become violent when confronted about stealing his father's money, and that she had thrown a wine glass at Sarah when the young woman tried to protect Robert from further financial abuse. Sarah tried to explain that the whole incident had been an accident, that Patricia had never intended to hurt anyone, and that James had been the aggressor throughout the evening. But Sarah's explanation was complicated and emotional, while James's story was clear and seemingly supported by the physical evidence. Patricia was arrested for assault with a deadly weapon and elder abuse. The story made the local news that night, with Patricia portrayed as a gold-digging widow who had violently attacked a young caregiver in front of her elderly husband. The arrest destroyed Patricia's reputation overnight, but it also triggered an investigation that would expose secrets James Mitchell had never intended to reveal. Detective Maria Santos had worked domestic violence cases for 15 years, and something about this incident bothered her from the beginning. The physical evidence didn't quite match James's story. Sarah's injuries were consistent with an accident rather than an intentional attack, and most importantly, Robert Mitchell's reaction to his wife's arrest suggested that he understood exactly what had happened and disagreed with the charges against Patricia. Detective Santos began digging deeper into the Mitchell family finances, looking for evidence of the elder abuse that James claimed to have discovered. What she found instead was a pattern of medical expenses, care costs, and treatment payments that painted a picture of a woman desperately trying to save her husband's life with every resource available to them. Patricia had indeed spent hundreds of thousands of Robert's dollars, but every penny had been spent on his medical care, with his full knowledge and explicit consent. The supposed financial abuse was actually an elderly man's decision to spend his fortune fighting for more time with the woman he loved. Detective Santos also discovered something else during her investigation, something that would completely change how everyone understood this family's story. Sarah Williams had been more than just a caregiver to Robert Mitchell. 3 months earlier, Sarah had submitted a DNA sample to a genealogy website, hoping to learn more about her biological father, who had abandoned her mother when Sarah was 2 years old. The results had revealed a shocking connection that Sarah had been trying to work up the courage to discuss with Robert before the October incident destroyed any chance of a peaceful family conversation. Sarah Williams was Robert Mitchell's biological daughter, conceived during a brief relationship with her mother in 1994. A year before Robert met Patricia. Sarah had discovered that the man she'd been caring for was actually her father, but she'd never told him the truth because she didn't want him to think she was working for him only to claim an inheritance she'd never known existed. The DNA revelation transformed the entire legal case and public perception of what had happened that October night. Sarah hadn't been protecting a stranger from family conflict. She'd been protecting her own father from a son who wanted to institutionalize him against his will. Patricia hadn't been stealing from her husband's estate. She'd been spending money that belonged to a man who had 2 children, not 1, and whose daughter had been providing his daily care without asking for any compensation beyond her minimum wage salary. James Mitchell hadn't been protecting his father from financial abuse. He'd been trying to isolate an elderly man from the 2 women who genuinely loved him, while positioning himself to inherit money that morally belonged to someone else. The charges against Patricia were dropped immediately, but the damage to her emotional health and public reputation would take years to repair. The story should have ended there, with truth revealed and justice served, but the final twist in the Mitchell inheritance case was still to come. During the investigation, Detective Santos had discovered that Robert Mitchell's net worth in 2023 was not the $50 million that James expected to inherit, or even the $23 million that the business had been worth in 1985. Robert's estate consisted of approximately $800,000 in savings, a house worth $400,000, and a life insurance policy that would pay Patricia $300,000 upon his death. The $50 million inheritance that had caused this family civil war existed only in James's imagination and assumptions. Robert had spent most of his fortune during the 20 years since Dorothy's death, donating millions to veterans organizations, medical research foundations, and scholarships for children of military families. He'd given away his wealth quietly and systematically, never mentioning his charitable giving to his son because he didn't want James to feel guilty about money that was gone. The man who James thought was being financially abused by a greedy stepmother had actually been one of the most generous philanthropists in his community, distributing his life's work to causes that mattered more to him than leaving a massive inheritance. Robert Mitchell died peacefully in his sleep on March 22, 2024, 5 months after the incident that had torn his family apart. He was surrounded by Patricia and Sarah, the two women who had loved him unconditionally and cared for him with dignity throughout his illness. His will, written in 2019 when his mind was completely clear, left the house and remaining savings to Patricia as planned, with a separate bequest of $50,000 to Sarah Williams, identified in the document as his daughter, and the person who had brought unexpected joy to his final years. James Mitchell inherited exactly what his father thought he deserved, which was nothing beyond the knowledge that he had spent his father's last months trying to separate him from the people who made his life worth living. The legal fees for James's failed court challenge to his father's will cost him more than twice what he would have inherited anyway. Today, Patricia Mitchell lives quietly in the house she shared with Robert, surrounded by photo albums, military memorabilia, and memories of 21 years with a man who taught her that love is the only wealth that matters. Sarah Williams used her inheritance to complete nursing school and now works as a hospice care specialist, helping other families navigate the final chapters of their loved ones' lives with grace and dignity. She named her youngest son Robert, and every year on his birthday she takes flowers to her father's grave and tells him stories about the grandson he never got to meet. The Mitchell Construction Building still stands on the outskirts of town, now housing a non-profit organization that provides free legal services to elderly people facing financial abuse from their own families. Robert's legacy isn't measured in dollars or property transfers, but in the lives he touched, the causes he supported, and the example he set for treating people with respect regardless of their economic status or family connections. James Mitchell returned to his investment banking career in New York, never speaking publicly about the inheritance case or his relationship with his father. Those who knew him before the incident say he was changed by the experience, perhaps finally understanding that some things in life matter more than money, though whether that understanding came too late to save his relationship with his family is a question only he can answer. The wine glass that started this entire conflict was never replaced, and Patricia keeps the few remaining fragments in a small jewelry box on her dresser, not as a reminder of that terrible October night, but as a symbol of how quickly misunderstandings and assumptions can shatter relationships that should have been unbreakable. The real tragedy of the Mitchell inheritance case isn't that a family fought over money, but that they fought over money that was never the point of anything Robert had tried to build or preserve during his 80 years of life. Before we finish this story, let me ask you the question that haunts everyone who learns about what happened to the Mitchell family. If you discovered that someone you'd been caring for was actually your biological father, and you saw him being mistreated by family members who were supposed to protect him, what would you have done? Would you have revealed the truth immediately, risking accusations that you were only after inheritance money? Would you have stayed silent and continued providing care without acknowledgement or appreciation? Or would you have done exactly what Sarah Williams did, stepping into harm's way to protect someone you loved without asking for anything in return? This case forces us to examine our own assumptions about family, money, and what we owe to the people who raised us versus the people who actually care about our well-being when we're most vulnerable. The Mitchell inheritance war reveals uncomfortable truths about how money changes people, how assumptions can blind us to reality, and how the people we dismiss as unimportant are sometimes the ones who love us most authentically. Robert Mitchell never needed $50 million to live a rich life, and he never needed to leave a massive inheritance to prove his love for his family. What he needed was exactly what Patricia and Sarah provided, which was respect, companionship, and care that wasn't conditional on financial reward. The son who expected to inherit everything lost everything that actually mattered, while the women who expected nothing gained the satisfaction of knowing they had honored a good man's final years with the dignity and love he deserved. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money or property, but the knowledge that you treated someone well when they needed you most, and that's a legacy that can never be taken away by lawyers, courts, or family members who measure love in dollars and cents. Before we move forward, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.